bill is passed.
Tonight, after last night's historic but narrow approval in the House, health care reform moves to the Senate, where it faces an uncertain future. I'm Russ Mitchell. Also tonight, investigators scour the record of the accused Fort Hood gunman, searching for a motive for the crime that shocked the nation. The people of Berlin prepare to mark tomorrow's 20th anniversary of the end of the communist-era wall. And hang on tight for the very wild ride to become the bull riding champion of the world.
This is the CBS Evening News with Russ Mitchell.
And good evening. We begin tonight with health care reform, which passed in the House of Representatives last night by the narrowest of margins. The final vote was 220 to 215, with just one Republican voting in favor. 39 Democrats voted against it. The debate moves next to the Senate, where approval in any form is far from guaranteed. Kimberly Dozier has more from Washington.
3, 2, 1. Countdown to the first major health care bill to pass the House in decades.
The yeas are 220, the nays are 215.
It's the first concrete step toward the Obama administration's signature issue of health reform.
The bill is passed.
Under the plan, 36 million uninsured Americans would get coverage over the next decade. Most Americans would be required to have insurance or pay a fine. Employers with payrolls over $500,000 would have to provide their employees coverage or pay a fine. No one could be denied coverage because of a pre-existing condition. And the plan includes government-run insurance, the so-called public option. The price tag, $1.2 trillion over 10 years. But it's supposed to cut $400 billion from the cost of Medicare. The Democrats had to include two compromises to win over their own conservatives. They added an amendment banning the use of federal funds for abortion, and they banned illegal immigrants from the public option insurance plan. The bill got a single Republican vote, Representative Joseph Cowell from New Orleans. The White House won him over in the waning hours of the debate with pledges to help his struggling city.
Now it falls on the United States Senate to take the baton and bring this effort to the finish line on behalf of the American people. And I'm absolutely confident that they will.
But the House bill is vastly different from what's been proposed in the Senate.
The House bill is dead on arrival in the Senate.
The Senate's version thus far has no public option because it's a deal breaker for most Republicans and some Democrats.
If the public option plan is in there, as a matter of conscience, I will not allow this bill to come to a final vote.
As historic as this vote was, the White House is only a third the way there. It needs 60 votes in the Senate. That's all 58 Democrats plus both independents. And there are already some doubters in that group. Then it's got to meld both bills together. So we could be looking at next spring before we know if there will be health care reform. Russ?
Kimberly Dozier on Capitol Hill. Thank you very much. And as Kimberly mentioned, last night's vote of approval only came after a trade-off on abortion funding that was opposed by House liberals. Michelle Miller is covering that part of the story.
The abortion debate heated up in the halls of Capitol Hill and on the House floor itself.
It is outrageous. It further places the religious views, mind you, of some into our public policy.
I rise today to urge the passage of this vital amendment.
The controversial amendment introduced by Democrat Bart Stupak and Republican Joe Pitts would bar any new government insurance plan from covering abortions, an extension of a law which its authors say has been on the books since the 1970s.
I am not writing a new federal abortion policy. The Hyde Amendment already prohibits federal funding of abortion.
Late last night, the amendment passed 240 to 194.
The amendment's adopted.
It was a major concession for pro-abortion rights Democrats to ensure the success of the overall health care bill and secure the 218 votes needed to win passage. But abortion rights activists say it was a huge step back.
The fact of the matter is, the health care debate should be covering all Americans, including women and their reproductive health.
64 Democrats joined 176 Republicans to vote for the amendment. And anti-abortion activists say that may be a sign.
It was very exciting last night to see demonstrated that there is a bipartisan pro-life majority in the House, and that reflects the pro-life majority in America.
But abortion opponents aren't declaring victory just yet. The bill now goes to the Senate, where ardent defenders of abortion rights promise to remove the amendment from the final version of the health care plan. Michelle Miller, CBS News, New York.
For more on last night's health care vote and its prospects in the Senate, we are joined by our senior political correspondent, Jeff Greenfield. Jeff, good evening.
Hi, Russ.
What are some of the roadblocks between what the House passed last night and an actual health care law as we move forward?
The first is just the very different nature of the two houses. In the House, as we saw last night, you can pass a bill with a bare majority. In the Senate, with 100 members, you need 60 votes to start debate on a bill, and you need 60 votes, more importantly, to end debate on the bill. There are 60 Democrats and independents who vote like Democrats in the Senate, but you've already got a couple of them expressing doubts about this bill, so it's very hard to see how what we saw last night come out of the House passes. Then there's the pesky matter of substance. Take one example. In the House bill, there's a so-called millionaire's tax, a surcharge on affluent families and individuals. There's no way that's going to get through the Senate. We know that now, or at least think we do. Now, if that doesn't get through the Senate, then where does the money come from to pay for that bill? So that's just a couple of examples of a couple of the dilemmas.
Only one Republican in the House voted for the bill last night, Joseph Cao of Louisiana, who comes from a generally Democratic district. Yeah. Historically, does that have any significance at all?
Yeah, I think it does. We generally see is that landmark legislation like this often takes bipartisan majorities. In 1935, for instance, when the Congress passed Social Security, 16 Republican senators voted for it, and only 5 voted against it. In the House, most Republicans voted for it. On the Medicare bill in 1965, almost as many Republicans in the House voted for it as against it, and almost as many Republicans, I think 13 in the Senate voted for it, 17 opposed. Now, by contrast, this looks like the kind of vote we got when Bill Clinton got his budget through the Congress in 1993 by 1 vote in each House. No Republicans voted for it. And you can see how the lack of bipartisanship probably means that next year this is going to be a campaign issue for Republicans, even if something called health care passes. It's very unusual to have something that changes so fundamental a fact as health care pass without a bipartisan vote.
Jeff Greenfield, thank you very much.
Okay, Russ.
The Army's Fort Hood in Texas and the surrounding community took first tentative steps today to move on from last week's shootings that left 13 dead and dozens wounded. And investigators learned more about the accused killer. Dean Reynolds is at Fort Hood.
In the wake of the tragedy, the Fort Hood community today sought a measure of comfort in their places of worship.
This has truly been a horrific last few days, and every person has been touched in some way by this tragedy.
And at the fort itself, commanders took pains to deal with the trauma and potential side effects that may plague the troops here.
We're offering and encouraging anyone who thinks they might need any kind of help to please seek it.
150 miles away, with the Army and FBI waiting to question him, Major Nidal Malik Hassan was breathing on his own and in stable condition at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, recovering from the 4 gunshot wounds that put a stop to the rampage last Thursday, when Hassan allegedly turned a laser-guided, high-powered pistol on a crowd of about 300 soldiers at the Readiness Center here, including 5 from his own Afghanistan-bound mental health unit, and, authorities say, even kept shooting outside where civilian police officers Kimberly Munley and Mark Todd brought him down. The motive remains unknown, but as investigators dig deeper into the man, the mind, and the massacre, a picture is emerging of an American soldier whose actions and associations suggest more than a passing interest in radical anti-Western Islam. The FBI is now checking whether Hassan may have attended the same mosque in suburban Washington that ministered to 2 of the September 11th hijackers, may actually have come into contact with Nawaf al-Hazmi and Hani Hanjour, and heard the inflammatory sermons of an imam known for backing terrorist organizations. Agents are trying to determine if the imam, Anwar al-Awlaki, may have fostered Hassan's radicalization. Al-Awlaki is currently in Yemen. In addition, sources say Hassan's computer files seized by the FBI reveal that he visited websites promoting radical Islamic views. And yet officials stress that while the investigation remains fluid, the evidence so far, after more than 170 interviews, indicates Hassan acted alone. Russ?
Dean Reynolds at Fort Hood. Thank you. And still ahead on tonight's CBS Evening News, the people of Fort Hood remember the fallen. And when we come back, a Supreme Court hearing on life sentences without parole for juveniles. Tomorrow, the Supreme Court will hear appeals from 2 Florida men sentenced to life without parole. One was 13 when he raped an elderly woman. The other was 16 when he took part in an armed robbery. An estimated 2,500 juvenile offenders nationwide are serving similar sentences, 109 of them for non-capital crimes. Of those, 77 are serving in Florida. For more perspective on the Supreme Court case, we are joined in Denver by CBS News legal analyst Andrew Cohen. Andrew, good evening to you.
Good evening.
First up, what are the constitutional issues at stake here?
Well, the issue is whether or not life sentences without parole for these young people who are convicted and sentenced before they're 18 violates the cruel and unusual punishment clause of the 8th Amendment to the Constitution. Florida says no, it doesn't. These 2 men say yes, it does, that because people are unformed mentally, intellectually, emotionally before 18, that there ought to be a little bit more leeway, at least some sort of ability for parole.
Andrew, when you look at the current makeup of the Supreme Court, does it give you any indication as to which way this case will play out?
You know, it really doesn't, Russ. That's a great question. 4 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court outlawed capital punishment for juvenile offenders. The 5 justices who did it, 4 are still on the court. The one who isn't is David Souter. He's been replaced by the newest Justice Sotomayor. So the question is she going to join that 4-member coalition and perhaps extend a little bit further protections for juvenile offenders, or is she going to side with the more conservative side of the court and say, no, death penalty is different, this is life sentence, and we're going to sort of keep the line here. So it's going to be a 5-4 decision either way. We just don't know which way.
I see. We know for economic reasons a number of states are actually releasing prisoners to save money. Is that an argument that the petitioners could use in this particular case?
I don't think so, Russ, but I think that's sort of the undertone here to this whole case. You have the Florida Attorney General telling the U.S. Supreme Court in these briefs, look, we have to keep these kids locked away without parole. They've committed crimes, usually multiple crimes, and they deserve to pay. And then you have the Florida legislature, on the other hand, since these cases have been filed, telling the Bureau of Prisons there, look, we got to release some people. It's just too expensive.
CBS News legal analyst Andrew Cohen. As always, thank you so much for your insight.
It's my pleasure.
Louisiana declared a state of emergency tonight ahead of strengthening Hurricane Ida. Ida could hit the U.S. Gulf Coast as early as Tuesday. A hurricane watch is up from east of New Orleans to the Florida Panhandle. Ida has already triggered flooding and mudslides in El Salvador that left at least 91 dead and dozens missing. Just ahead on tonight's CBS Evening News, it was a defining moment in history, the fall of the Berlin Wall, 20 years later. The Cold War between Western nations and the Soviet bloc, which haunted the world for decades, came to a symbolic end 20 years ago tomorrow with the fall of its most potent icon, the Berlin Wall. World leaders are gathering for a celebration in Berlin, and Mark Phillips is there.
20 years later, the crowds in Berlin stroll freely where the wall used to be, examining a row of giant dominoes prepared by school children for tomorrow's commemoration, or gazing at the wall art that was first painted 2 decades ago and which has been refurbished on the few remaining sections of the wall for the anniversary. It spurred a lot of memories.
I remember my grandma calling. I think everybody is leaving. What is going on? You know, are we going to be the last, the last ones to stay
It was a scary
in East
time.
Germany? Yeah.
Scary because the wall was more than just a wall. It was a physical and psychological barrier that ran for 96 miles, isolating West Berlin from the communist German Democratic Republic that surrounded it. It had developed from a crude barbed wire barricade into a complex structure with a 12-foot-high concrete barrier backed by vehicle trenches, an electric fence, and a cleared area which became known as the Killing Zone, a zone in which an estimated 200 people were shot as they tried to escape. But 20 years ago tomorrow, a series of events that seemed unfathomable beforehand became reality. Thousands of East Berliners thronged toward the wall, and the GDR government backed down. The border guards melted away, and so did the East German state. Today, Checkpoint Charlie, the famous Cold War crossing point, is a tourist attraction manned by pretend American soldiers. The colorful symbolic dominoes waiting to be knocked over stand where the ugly scar of the wall used to be. The falling dominoes are supposed to represent the fall of the wall, but they also symbolize something else, the collapse of communist governments that began here and went all the way to Moscow. Not just Berlin and Germany changed here 20 years ago, the world did. Mark Phillips, CBS News, Berlin.
And coming up on tonight's CBS Evening News, we'll look at the booming sport of bull riding and why hanging on could mean a big payday. Hari Srinivasan has more on a sport that's riding high.
With the fireworks of a rock concert and some of the biggest athletes you have ever seen, this is professional bull riding, one of the fastest growing sports in the country.
You're basically putting yourself on an animal that you've got totally no control over, and he's the boss for 8 seconds or a little longer.
The 45 best bull riders in the world compete week after week to do more than just hang on for dear life. The riders earn points for how easy they make it look, and the bulls earn points for how hard and fast they kick the riders off.
But you want the bull that kicks the highest, jumps the highest, spins the fastest. You want a bull that can really, that they call rank. I mean, they want the rankest bull out because that's where you're going to get the most points.
This black hat wearing, blackberry slinging CEO is riding on top of a $60 million enterprise that started with 20 bull riders putting up $1,000 apiece to break the sport away from traditional rodeos. That was 1992. Now there are more than 1,200 riders competing in 5 countries for more than $10 million in prize money a year. And yes, they are still bullish on growth.
Right now we're 8% up overall for the entire year.
Even with the economy
Even
down.
with the economy. And even this market here, we're going to be up probably 15 to 20% after this weekend.
The average rider on the PBR Tour weighs 150 pounds. The average bull weighs 10 times as much. And if the two are lucky, they'll be out there for 8 seconds.
When I die, I want to come back and the next world is a bull of mine.
A top-ranked bull can be worth as much as $1 million.
When you've got as much money in them as we have, you're going to make sure that you take excellent care of them.
And when a bull does its job, it can be a real pain for the riders.
Cracked my jaw, broke my nose, broke both hands.
It is one of the most dangerous sports in the world.
So what makes you want to go back on that bull after all that? Shoot, man, that's all I've ever done my whole life. Once you start doing it, it kind of gets in your blood.
It can also pay the bills. 22-year-old J.B. Money has already earned close to $2 million.
I want to marry him.
And the cowboy celebrity that comes with it. Hari Srinivasan, CBS News, Dallas.
Coming up next on tonight's CBS Evening News, a day of mourning at Fort Hood. And finally, this Sunday evening, we return to Fort Hood, Texas, where the shadow of Thursday's armed attack still hangs heavy over military families and civilians alike. Don Teague is there.
For 3 days, soldiers, family members, and neighbors of Fort Hood have mourned the dead.
Tragedies happen. In this community, we've had our fair share.
Worked to heal the wounded and prayed for strength to forgive.
We pray for Major Hassan's family.
In a place accustomed to painful send-offs and joyous homecomings, time here seems to have slowed to a crawl as the community searches for answers.
How could this happen? You know, what was going on? What happened?
But one of the worst weeks in this post's history is finally drawing to a close, and the Army must look forward. Preparations for war continue.
If anybody had been armed, I think they would have tried to at least shoot back at him.
For Corporal Nathan Hewitt, among those shot in Thursday's attack, the future lies in Iraq. He's set to deploy in January and hopes his injuries don't delay that.
Both to the side.
For military families, taking care packages to victims of the shootings today, the future means lending a shoulder to those who need it.
This is what the Army's about. So when something like this happens, you get immediate emails, phone calls, deliveries. People are driving up from across the country.
And for the extended Army family around Fort Hood,
my prayers goes out to the families that lost.
The future means trying to move on from tragedy. Don Teague, CBS News, Fort Hood, Texas.
And that is the CBS Evening News. I'm Russ Mitchell. Good night.